Okay.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. And Hannah, will I be able to share my screen?
You got it. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that in a second.
Okay.
Thanks for, giving me the opportunity to, join with you all today. I wish that, we were doing this in person like we've done in the past, but we'll do that again at some point. So rain checks issued to everyone. These elections, they keep coming with regularity. And also thanks for the plug for our new book, Securing American Elections. To be honest, it should be released today or tomorrow. It's coming out from Cambridge University Press, and when it's released, there'll be a free PDF online. And so you can, I'll figure out some way to get that around to campus. The fun part about that book is that it's co-authored with 3 of our PhD students. Yiming Lee, who's a current student, Sylvia Kim, who just graduated and is now a assistant professor at American University, and Nick Adams Cohen, who graduated, I guess, 2 years ago. And he's now a postdoc up at the Immigration Lab at Stanford. And it just, that's one of the great things about being a professor at Caltech, is working with our truly exceptional students. I'm gonna just move into a real quick slide deck that I just put together, just to give you some sort of my thoughts. And then of course, the main thing here is to move into a conversation and to do some Q&A. So I think most of you know me, so I'm not going to do too much of a detailed introduction, but we study elections at Caltech, and we've done that for a long time. And in our social science group is very strong in both political science and economics. And if anybody's interested, especially students, in the work that we do, or the classes, or the work in political science specifically, just reach out, rma@caltech.edu, and I'm happy to chat further. Okay, so kind of the key takeaways that I have this morning, and I'll talk about each of these in turn, is big sigh of relief because we did it. One of the things I think is a big takeaway is that our election infrastructure was actually quite robust to the pressures that were put on it over the last couple of days. Historic turnout. It's really remarkable to see the enthusiasm and the excitement, to see all the people who participated and all the different ways they participated, and I'll chat a little bit about the implications of that. Voting by mail, controversial in this election, but it was also historic. And that's a very, very important trend in how we conduct elections that has, I think, long-term ramifications for all of us who are voters here in the United States, but also for how we may conduct future elections, and I'll talk a little bit about that. What happened with the polls? Again, okay, the polls seem to be wrong. Again, maybe. We'll see as things move forward. I'll give you a couple of thoughts about that. What happened in Florida? Kind of a mystery there. Although, the mystery I think is going to start to clarify itself a little bit, and I'll give you some quick speculations there. And of course, we're still waiting to see what's going to be happening in a number of the other battleground states. Things are, in quite a bit of flux at this point, but I'm pretty confident that by the end of today, we'll have a pretty good sense for how the Electoral College is going to break down. Oh, that's the next point. When will it end? Probably, most likely, we'll know more today, but there's going to be a process moving forward from here, and we all need to be patient and let that happen. There's going to be recounts. There will be re-examinations and audits, and I do think that there is going to be some litigation as we move forward, so we'll end up in the courts. And then a few thoughts about the future as we head forward from here. Okay, so there we go. So yes, so we did it. It's remarkable to me. I think we really need to all just pat ourselves on the back collectively. We ran an election in the midst of this amazingly deadly pandemic. And I think that means that I think we should all be thanking our people who run elections, like here in LA County, Dean Logan, down in Orange County, Neil Kelly, our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla. They did a masterful job, I think, at trying to figure out ways to make this pandemic work. Poll workers, I was in polling places yesterday. Remarkable to see the people who volunteered in a pandemic to help make sure that we all could exercise our franchise. And maybe some of you were poll workers, and if so, thank you. You know, people, voters, you know, we all rose to the occasion. We got our ballots back on time. I think many people took the advice to make sure they didn't make mistakes. And I think that, you know, we're seeing a reflection of that. And it's just truly remarkable that, you know, we didn't see the massive intimidation and violence that we're predicting. Although, again, I do think we may see protests, you know, as the election clarifies. But you know, there weren't any massive electoral disruptions. There weren't massive disruptions and problems in polling places and vote centers yesterday. And there don't seem to have been any of the big, you know, database hacks or infrastructure hacks or attacks on our electoral infrastructure that we were expecting. Whether they didn't materialize or they were effectively prevented and mitigated, we don't know yet. But again, we don't see any evidence of those. And we're not seeing any evidence right now of massive fraud either. And so, you know, I think that we did a great job. Our infrastructure seems pretty robust, and you know, I think we're all very, very happy with that, and you know, we're proud of the work that we've done to try to maintain that. Despite that, I do think we'll hear about problems. There were many problems, little things that happened, and it always happens. And I do think we're going to hear more as recounts and legal challenges come forward in the next couple of days. There we go. Historic turnout. You know, the final numbers we're not going to know for some time, but you know, it's amazing that it appears that maybe somewhere between 160, 170 million Americans may have participated in this election. That will likely translate into a turnout rate that's probably historic, maybe not seen since well before the last pandemic, back to maybe around 1900 or so. That's truly remarkable. And you know, and typos, they were sent, sorry. And many of these ballots were sent and returned by mail, perhaps 60 or 70 million. So here's some really preliminary numbers. You can just kind of see a little bit as to what's going on. The blue is, this is LA County data that we've been collecting. The blue is from 2016 presidential. The orange is from this past election. And again, this is all very preliminary data. But you can see that more people were registered to vote in LA County than in 2016, which is amazing in its own right. You can see on the far right that the turnout rate in LA County has gone up just a little bit, and that's going to go up more, right? There are more ballots that are going to be counted and added to the totals here, so that's going to change. You can see the dramatic increase in the number of votes that were cast by mail in LA County, and I think that's going to continue. And you can also see the drop in the number of people who voted in person. Now, some of that's pandemic effects, right? But still, it's a dramatic fall. We had precinct voting in 2016, and in 2020, we had early and election day vote center voting. We're also studying Orange County pretty closely, and here's kind of similar numbers from Orange County. And again, so this is just saying that these kind of trends in California are kind of across the board. Many more registered voters. That's one indication of enthusiasm and interest. Turnouts is up from 2016, and again, that number will go up. Turnout's going to be higher than this. Orange County has had more voting by mail in the past than LA County, but still you can see that it rose at, you know, over 1 million ballots were sent by mail in Orange County. And you know, the in-person process that Orange County uses, they're not breaking out the election day versus early voters just yet. But you can see again a decline in the number of people who participated in person over the last couple of days. So what happened with the polls? Again, this is going to be something I think we may hear more about. A lot of it depends on what happens with some of these battleground states. But the initial perspective on this is that, you know, the polls seem to perhaps maybe have been a bit wrong again. And it doesn't take a lot of being a bit wrong to fuel a lot of concern and consternation. I mean, what exactly is going on? There may have been a variety of different things going on here. We don't know yet, but you know, like in Florida, for example, this is Florida, Iowa, North Carolina, just poll the polls from CNN, which is their aggregate averages, versus what I was seeing as of about 8 o'clock this morning. And you know, you take Florida, for example, and it seems that, you know, maybe that they were off by 1%, 1.5% in each direction, right? Now, why that happened yet again, not entirely clear. It could be that, again, there might have been shy Trump voters in Florida. There might have been pandemic differences in who was likely to answer an invitation to do a survey. There might have been turnout differences that weren't modeled correctly. Again, it's all hard to know, but it does appear to me that there could very well be a slight bias in some of the polling that we'll have to investigate a little further as we move forward. Florida was a surprise. Many of you who I talked to before the election, my advice was to keep an eye on Florida last night. And what is interesting about Florida is if you look at the county by county votes as of early this morning, at least, Biden-Trump support in across Florida counties lines up pretty much with what it looked like in 2016, with the big exception of Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade actually is a really big outlier in Florida right now. It was plus 29 for Democrats in 2016, and now it's maybe only plus 7. And Miami-Dade's one of the bigger counties in Florida. It's got maybe 1.2 million registered voters. So does this explain Trump's victory or apparent victory in Florida? Maybe, but it's a big outlier. And it's hard to know exactly at this point what caused this. Is it just misreporting? Is there something glitchy about their data at this point? Hard to know. But substantively, one of the things that does seem to have happened in Florida, and in particular in Miami-Dade, is that there might be shifts in some of the demographics of party support that are going on. In particular, Cuban Americans, there's a pretty sizable population of Cuban Americans there, seem to perhaps have shifted their support more strongly in favor of President Trump than in 2016. And we're seeing some interesting patterns with Hispanic and Latino political behavior in this election. Clearly, we've heard a lot about how they're not monolithic. That's definitely true. Marissa Abrajano and I wrote one of these books about the Hispanic and Latino vote, and that's an argument that we made. But I think that's a population that we're going to need to really study more closely in the future. Also, Black participation and Black political support in this election. Not entirely sure. I haven't seen much of exit polls right now, but there are some indications that there might be some shifting patterns in Black support as well for Democratic and Republican candidates. So we'll need to be looking very, very closely at that. I'm almost done, and we'll do Q&A in just a second. So when will this end? We're still counting, and I put this together at 8 a.m. this morning. So this morning we're going to be counting into the afternoon. I don't know if they've called some of the additional states because I was just in class, but that will be happening this afternoon. What I think we'll start to see is that the initial tabulations will start to wind down. They'll start in many of these states to start to count some of the late arriving ballots, the provisionals, and then to shift towards perhaps recounting the close races. In some of these states, these recounts are automatic. They're triggered by the fact that it's a close election. In some of these states, these recounts may be requested statewide or in parts of the states by the candidates. That's a normal part of the process, and candidates have the right to those recounts, and we are going to have to be patient as that process moves forward. And I think there's a likelihood that this will end up in the courts. The president has already come out and said that his lawyers are going to come in. I wouldn't be surprised to see that. That's what happens in close elections, and I think we need to let that process play out. As we need to make sure that all votes get counted, and that we do everything we can to scrutinize this election as closely as possible to ensure that it was run freely and fairly, and that there's a high degree of integrity in this election outcome. So some simple thoughts for the future, and these are some of the things that my research group has started to talk about already. Is this level of historic participation? We need to understand, was it driven by the pandemic? Was it driven by a reflection, a referendum on the presidency? Was it driven by the expansion of voting by mail? Is there just more enthusiasm and interest because of the engagement that many people have been involved in over the last few months, in particular with the protests this summer? We don't know. We're collecting data. We're in fact fielding some large surveys that are starting to go in the field right now to try to gather information and to better assess and understand these participation changes. Voting by mail. Voting by mail is clearly, here to stay in many states. In California, we're going to be shifting heavily towards voting by mail, although still probably allowing the opportunity for in-person voting. But that's a big change in how we administer elections and how we conduct elections that, I do think is the wave of the future, not only in California, but in many of the rest of the United States. Some of you know this, Oregon votes by mail entirely, Washington state votes by mail entirely, Colorado votes by mail entirely. California is likely to join those other Western states in moving heavily in this direction. There is a important transformation that's going on in the U.S., and this is something to also focus on. We're very polarized. I think this election just demonstrates that the degree of polarization that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years is continuing, if not deepening. There's also, political changes in the geography. I never thought that I would be, studying a presidential election in which Arizona was in play. Nevada, Georgia, some of these other states that are moving into play and becoming battleground states themselves are undergoing transformations politically, economically, socially that we need to better understand because the political landscape in the country is changing. That said, again, polarization is a significant issue. And I do think that that's going to be something that whoever is the next president, they're gonna need to start to grapple with, because we do need to figure out how we can get along a little bit better as a country moving forward. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And Hannah, I'll turn it back over to you for however you want to run the Q&A.
You got it. Okay, so if those who would like to ask the question directly, please feel free to virtually raise your hand. There are some who are asking questions in the chat as well. But let's go ahead and get started. And I have like 13 questions, but one of them being about the recounts, because I've been nonstop just watching what's going on and definitely calling for recounts in Pennsylvania and things like that. Has there ever been precedent of where a recount has shifted the actual results of the election?
Oh yeah, there are. I mean, I can't, to be honest, come up with them off the top of my head. But when they go back and they re-examine ballots, sometimes what happens is some ballots will get removed from the tally. Oftentimes ballots will get added to the tally. So the reported results will shift, and sometimes these recounts, which again are part of the process, can lead to changes in the outcomes of very, very close elections.
Okay. Joe Shea wanted to know, would the USPS undelivered ballots potentially have made a difference in Florida?
Joe, that's a great question. Thank you for that. I haven't examined the actual numbers. The answer could be yes. It all depends on exactly how many of those ballots exist. And I haven't myself yet seen a precise number on that. If you know one, let me know. But it's possible. Again, these are things that these kind of issues, crop up and arise. And we had been advising people to try to get their ballots in early if they had to send them by mail, or if possible, to take them to an official drop box or drop them off at a vote center, just to try to avoid these very problems. But we don't, at this point, really have a good sense for the extent to which undelivered U.S. Postal Service ballots might be an issue in Florida or other states.
So, Mary, do you want to ask your question? You have a couple questions here on the chat. One about could phone surveys just simply not be representative? And this is a serious question, but what would it take for the 3 West Coast states to secede and form a separate union?
The latter question is a question my wife keeps bringing up. I don't know if she's here too, and she's going to upvote that same question. To be honest, that's talked about. I know, I don't know whether it's tongue in cheek and facetious or a real conversation, but I do think we're part of the United States, and my opinion is we should stay. The benefits of being part of the country, in my opinion, outweigh the costs. But because I certainly wouldn't want to have a passport to travel to New Mexico, for example, where I spend a lot of time. But the polls, this is something we're gonna have to very carefully examine, because if it does turn out that there was yet again another systematic failure like in 2016, we do need to get to the root of this, because polling is important. I mean, polling and surveying is an important part of the work that we do in the research community, and it's an important thing. Caltech does polls. The industry relies on polls, and of course, politicians and the government rely on opinion data as well. So we need to get to the bottom of these problems. Back when I was a graduate student, back a million years ago, back in the late 80s, polling was easy. You basically, people had landlines. If you called them on the landline, they answered the phone. And so, we could rely on pretty simple methods like random digit dialing, where you can just program a computer dialer to just randomly call phone numbers. And you could get a pretty decent representative random population sample with that methodology. As you all know, I don't know, there's 180 people here. I'll bet you that maybe 10 of you have landlines, maybe 20. Very few of you had landlines. And even though we have one, we never answer it. And so, that kind of methodology no longer works. And in this cycle, pollsters were relying on all sorts of different ways to get people to respond to their surveys, polling them online, calling them on landlines, calling them on cell phones, sometimes doing all of the above, and even in some cases using text. Some of you may have received text invitations to do surveys in this election. Those kind of multimodal approaches are very difficult to implement well, and they don't necessarily result in a truly random probability scientific sample like we want to see. A lot of these are effectively non-probability designs, and so they become very difficult to use to actually study the electorate. The other issue that I think is going on possibly here is that it's a pandemic. And so, who knows how to get people to answer a survey during a pandemic? I think that there were probably, it's likely that, there were slight, kind of differences on Republican respondents and Democratic respondents in their willingness or likelihood to answer surveys. That could just be because of interest. It could also just be because of availability in terms of who was home and who was engaged and who really wanted to talk to a pollster. We'll have to get to the bottom of this. There's a number of hypotheses, but I do think we're going to have yet another re-examination of polling practices after 2020.
Mike, what about your practices of like looking at Twitter data and social media data? Like, would that be a better representative sample? I know there's some bias, obviously, in who self-selects into these social media channels, but I wonder if some of your work could kind of translate as a replacement for polling.
Well, and that's a great question, and that's one of the things that we and others have been investigating. And thanks for the plug on our work. By the way, if you're interested in seeing this, go to monitoringtheelection.us. There's a little tab there for our Twitter election monitor. It's remarkable. Jen Chow, who's PhD or postdoc in my group, Jen put together these amazing graphics. We had a Zoom call earlier today because of the election. We're now for these election monitors, we're collecting over 200 tweets per second. That's amazing. And the group has built some tools and an architecture for not only collecting data with that high degree of frequency and very high dimensionality, but also storing it, processing, and analyzing it. So we're collecting a lot of that data. At this point, it's not a great substitute, right, for polling data because it's not representative. I don't know, many of you probably aren't even on Twitter. And those of you who are may not be active. You may just follow some friends or some media personalities or some sporting figures or something like that. But it's not representative. We know that there are various biases in the data. But what we use them for is to track trends and to follow trends in conversations, and we are trying to figure out ways to try to use it to supplement or to use kind of as measures of public opinion in addition to traditional sources of polling. The polling I talked about that we're going to be doing, it's actually in the field right now, is through YouGov. One of our former PhD students is a VP at YouGov, and we're working with her, Delia Bailey, on this poll. And we've got a number of questions in the poll where we're asking people if they use social media like Twitter. And one of the things that is on the docket for our research group to work on is to try to see if there are some ways that we can connect a truly anonymous random probability sample of opinion to some of the Twitter data that we've been collecting. And we're going to be hopefully finding the bandwidth to work on that later this academic year.
We have like now 12 other questions here. So is it possible to get people out of these social echo chambers that create these polarizations that you were referencing in your PowerPoint, and to create more dialogue in the middle? Or do you think the tech companies have just let this problem expand out of control?
Well, to be honest, companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google, they're companies. They're there to make a profit. And so, they're going to do everything they can to drive further engagement on their platform. And I, while I think that there's a good argument that they have some responsibility, again, they're companies that are U.S. companies, and they make a lot of money off of providing us the services they provide. On the other hand, they're there to make a profit, and so I think we need to be careful about blaming them for some of these patterns that are arising. I do think they have some responsibility, but ultimately, as human beings, I think we naturally tend to be friends with people who are like us, who think like us, and who share our opinions. We associate with people either in person or online who are like us. And I think that this is an issue that we were just talking about in my IPS 101 class. Ultimately it's really down to we as citizens to try to become better informed and to better police the information that that we seek out and that we use. And I think that we can think of ways to try, again, as academic researchers, to build tools and applications that might help people. Mm-hmm. I've got a number of colleagues in Europe who do research on what are called voting advice applications, which have been shown in a number of studies to help improve how informed people are about the choices that they face in elections. And there's also some evidence that they may further engage people and get them more excited about turning out to vote. But those are used in a different kind of electoral context than we have here, and they haven't really been successfully imported into the U.S. political context where we have, first past the post, two candidate elections. But I do think that we need to move forward with trying to figure out how to build technologies that voters can use to become better informed, mm-hmm. and to perhaps, be less polarized in their conversations online and in person.
So I think it's super exciting that you were saying we had the historic voter turnout, and you talked a little bit about Florida. What do you think are some of the other big shifts in the voter turnout from the 2016 to now, in terms of demographics?
Well, to be honest, I don't know at this point, because we just don't have that kind of data yet.
Yeah.
But I think those are going to be patterns that we're going to be looking very carefully at. To give you one example, I suspect that the protests that occurred this summer, mm-hmm. Likely engaged many young voters throughout the country. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're going to find when we start to collect some of this data that that's the case.
Yeah.
And I think then breaking that down a little further, looking at some of the the different demographics. I really want to see, how the protests in particular and participation in those protests or awareness of those protests really may have helped fuel engagement and involvement in this election.
Yeah.
I think that's going to tell us a lot about how we can continue to engage young voters moving forward, and voters of color in particular. I think we need to do a lot to keep young voters in particular involved in the process. So, again, we'll be studying that as we get additional data, and that's a great question.
Yeah. So as these numbers are coming in through all these news outlets, for example, Ram talks about Michigan, as at one point early this morning, the total vote in Michigan jumped to 138,339 votes. All of those votes went to Biden, and no other totals were increasing for Trump. Is there a reasonable explanation for how those votes all went to just one candidate versus another? And I think this is a worrisome kind of situation in general, because most of the votes that are still counted are all these mail-in votes, right? So.
Yeah, great question. Yiming Li, who I mentioned earlier, PhD student, and Michelle Wynn, who's an undergraduate, we have a paper that's actually under review at a political science journal that looks at this phenomenon, focusing a lot in Orange County, but also looking at other counties and states. In the past, up until this election, there's been a very consistent pattern that people call the blue shift, where votes that were cast early, especially mail votes, tended to come from Republicans. And late arriving absentee ballots, in-person ballots on election day, and also provisional ballots that would be counted later in the tabulation process, tended to come from Republican or Democratic voters. And so in really close elections, like we saw this in Orange County in 2018 and some of the House contests there, on election night, the totals would skew Republican, and some of the Republican candidates even thought they might have won the election. But as these late arriving ballots came in that came from Democratic voters, consistently those vote totals shifted towards Democratic candidates. What we're seeing here, I think, is that this phenomenon has kind of been stood on its head, right? It's been reversed. And I think it has a lot to do with the party tactics and the rhetoric from our political leaders. President Trump coming out and complaining about voting by mail and talking about fraud and urging his supporters to show up and vote in person. I think that worked. I think the Democratic efforts to get their voters to vote early by mail, I think that worked. But what we see, in the processing of ballots, and I know this can be a little bit disconcerting for those who are following these numbers very closely, is ballots will get, they're not coming in randomly, okay? They're coming in batches, and these batches are coming from, they could be coming, it could be going back to what Joe asked before. They could have just gone to the post office and picked up a batch of ballots from the post office. They could have just picked up a batch of ballots from a couple of precincts that skew very heavily for one candidate or the other. They're not necessarily obtaining nor processing these ballots in some random order. And so I don't think you ought to read a lot into that. I just think that you just got to realize that these ballots are being processed as quickly as possible, and they're not being they're not randomized in some way. And so the vote totals are going to keep shifting and flopping back and forth in some of these states and counties.
So there's a couple of questions. I'm going to go back to your polling conversation. Could the polls be reaching people who are just not eligible to vote, and so therefore they're skewed? And if it is somewhat representative, do polls actually include some modeling of the turnout? Like, what's the relationship between the polls and the turnout rate? Because it seems like polls could be correct, but the turnout models are maybe wrong. So it's unclear as to the language that's being used.
A great question. And so there, we could, I have at least, a week in my PS 120 class where we talk about a lot of these detailed issues, and I'll try to respond to it really quickly. And whoever's, has questions about this, you want to send me more email, I'd be happy to carry on this conversation further. A high quality poll, okay, the kind of polls that we like to do as researchers will be what we call a probability sample, right? We have a population, we have a list of contact information for that population, and we draw in some known way from that list so that we can replicate we know the probability that someone's been selected into our sample, so that we can then gauge non-response, and we can then correctly try to re-weight that data statistically back to the population. I know that's a mouthful. That's an entire lecture, how we do that, right? And now the problem is we don't know with a lot of these public polls the extent to which they take those steps. We don't even know some of these public polls if they're truly, how they're sampling, where their lists come from. And in particular, we don't have any idea as to how they're trying to weight their data back to some known population targets. Right. They very rarely release this information, and so it's really hard to evaluate. Now, What a high quality poll in say this election would have done is it probably would have started with a list of registered voters in the state. And with that list of registered voters, you have their contact information, or you can merge that contact information from other sources.
Okay.
So you have an email or a phone number or an address, and you could try to contact them using various means, contact them, members of a sample, using various means. Now, what you would then do is you would either ask them some questions about how likely they are to vote and filter out those people who weren't likely to vote. Or you could actually try to model that in advance based on data where you could model who's likely to vote and only contact those people from the sample. Now, again, that's what a high quality polling operation would do. We really don't know when you take a look at the polls, you don't know what they're doing, whether it's based on some simple self-reported questions or one question like, are you likely to vote? Or is it based on a complicated and sophisticated model that might be maybe more accurate? These are all based on assumptions too. I'm sorry, Hannah, go ahead.
No, I just said they got to show their work. We got to know their methodologies and what you're saying here.
Well, they're not held to the same standards that I am when I publish one of these things in an academic journal, right? And so, there's organizations like APOR, which is, a professional organization which tries to mandate certain guidelines on reporting. But, pollsters don't necessarily abide by those. And even if they do, they don't provide much of this information. So we really don't know what they do. But again, a sophisticated, poll would try to figure out ways to really ask the questions only to a sample of registered voters who, in most cases, are likely to vote. Could these samples include ineligible voters? Yeah, of course they could.
Right.
And what you try to do as a pollster is you try to avoid the inclusion of what you call non-eligible members of the population in your sample. And then what you do when you get the data is you try to sift through the data to try to find those kinds of respondents and filter them out.
So when sometimes you see the polls, this isn't one more question about the poll thing. You see white voters and they kind of show you the breakdown of college education or just education in general within the white voting population. Why don't they do that with the Black and Latinx folks? Like, why don't they break those down even generationally or even by education attainment?
Oh, that's usually what we call a coverage problem. So if you think about, so a lot of these polls, especially these statewide polls, have very small samples. If you actually look at them, they're samples of 400 or 600 likely voters. And, you can do the math. If in that state, you got a sample of 400 registered voters, and, the population is 10% Black in that state, you just don't have very much information. You don't have coverage of that population where you could do anything other than just maybe break it down simply by looking at Blacks versus whites. You can't really dig much further into that particular population. What you really need to do is you really need to do polls of these populations and draw representative samples of these populations to be able to make any strong inferences about them. That's difficult to do, and it's very expensive. And the pollsters, generally speaking, avoid conducting those kind of polls unless they're done, for particular projects for particular clients.
That makes sense. Monique, did you have a question you want to ask?
Yes, and I don't know, this is not related really to the polls, but just kind of like the process. I know that the Electoral College's origins are from the 3/5 Compromise from so long ago. And so if you could talk a little bit about that, and also do you think the system of Electoral College is outdated at this point?
Yes. Yes, good question. Now I'll have to tell you, I'm not the world's expert on the Electoral College. In fact, my colleague, Jonathan Katz, you can email him about it. He's the expert on the Electoral College, but seriously, it's the Electoral College is, just part of our history of our country, right? It goes, the origins of it and why it exists. It tends to perpetuate certain biases, that have been longstanding biases in how we engage in political representation in the United States. That said, is it going to go away anytime soon? Unlikely. There are efforts that, there's an effort to, engage in a kind of informal pact across states to try to allocate the electoral college votes more proportionally, more in a more representative way. That might be one way around it, but I'm not optimistic that we will ever change the Constitution to eliminate the electoral college.
So we've talked a lot about the presidential election. Can you talk a little bit about what your notes or analysis are about Senate and House elections? They seem to be, the House at least seems to be flipping Republican for this current election cycle. What are your thoughts on that?
We'll see. Those races, a lot of them are kind of hard to know at this point, especially U.S. House races. Like we're watching the ones very closely here in Southern California. A number of them are very, very close. Ones that went Democratic in the last cycle are really, really contested in this cycle. First-term incumbents are the most vulnerable incumbents around, and so we'll just have to see over the next in California, especially the next couple of weeks, what happens with those races. It's going to be, I think, really, really important to be tracking those elections because regardless of who's president, the makeup of the U.S. Congress is going to be very important for if President Trump continues as president. If the Congress does move to a more Republican Congress, I think that's going to change the outlook for his legislative agenda. If Biden becomes president, and there's a completely Republican Congress, that's going to make it difficult for him in a divided government to move forward with really strong progressive or Democratic agenda. So. We'll just have to see. I don't think we're going to know much about especially U.S. House races for a couple of weeks. I will say, to follow up on that, though, it is really interesting to see how California voted on the ballot measures. I haven't looked at them for about 2 hours, but in a state where Biden got 65% of the vote, which is a pretty strong performance by a Democrat. I do think that some of the very progressive measures that were on the ballot very significantly underperformed where you think they might have landed in this election cycle. So as I said earlier on KPCC this morning, if some of you were listening, it's like the mood of our electorate, not only in California, but nationally, just seems kind of very uncertain and to be honest, slightly cranky.
What happens? We had a lot of controversy about the post office with this current president. What happens to mail in operations when if the post office is controlled by the president, especially as all these states are going to voting by mail?
So we'll have to see who's president after this and what happens with the postal service. And the postal service has been in crisis for a long time for those of you who follow it. And they have been having difficulties responding to both the reduction in the amount of say first class mail, but also the increase in parcel delivery. And I think that they have an opportunity, and we'll just kind of see where the postal service goes. It's an important part of our culture to have mail delivery 6 days a week at every residential address in the country. And I know that many people rely very heavily on postal delivery for Social Security checks and other really, really important mail. So I don't think the postal service is going to go away anytime soon, but I do think that whoever's president is going to need to take some steps to really solidify its operations. Now moving forward, how that interacts with voting by mail. I think that in this cycle, what we saw was that, the most people, I think, we haven't heard about significant problems but with receipt of mail ballots. Mm-hmm. Some people didn't get them. I know that. And whether that's because of the Postal Service and delays or issues with their registration or some other problem is just unclear at this point. I think that, what we'll be able to do is rely, even in Postal Service in its current format, for outbound delivery of vote by mail ballots that, go out weeks before the election. I will still advise people voters to try to return those ballots maybe in other ways. I myself put mine in my Dropbox down by the Rose Bowl on Sunday, and it was I got my text message saying it was received and counted. I think that relying on the outbound mail for delivery, and then perhaps us taking the responsibility to try to make sure that we get it back in a timely manner might be the way to eliminate these concerns.
So there was a lot of talk and controversy around voter suppression from both sides, really, this election. What are your thoughts? And there's 26 countries who have mandatory voting. What are your thoughts on having some level of mandatory voting?
Compulsory voting in countries that implement it and enforce it works well. But those are countries that have a long-standing commitment to enforcing compulsory voting. So there are also countries that have compulsory voting that don't enforce it, and their turnout rates, aren't terribly. I mean, they're a little higher than ours, but they're not, terribly. They're not 100%. So, not only would we have to have a system of mandatory voting, we'd also have to enforce it. And I don't think that that's kind of in the future for the U.S. There are also people who I think legitimately argue that it's your right to not want to participate and abstain. And so I think that it also, in our system, it kind of butts up against that right to abstain and to not participate. I think that what we've seen over the last few cycles is that as states like California, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, many other states throughout the country move towards making the voting process more accessible. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean the process of registration. So now in California, we have something that's very close to an automatic voter registration system. You go to get your driver's license, you go to get some kind of social service at a government agency. They will ask you if you want to be registered and be able to proactively register you at that point. I think that has been shown, and I will be doing more research on that, to have some effects on improving registration and turnout rates. We need to do more to make sure that young people get registered. Some of them, many of them aren't even getting driver's licenses until they don't get that right away these days, and so we need to proactively engage our high schoolers, right? Get them registered to vote when they turn 18. Make sure that they have some mechanism to automatically register if they don't get their driver's license right away. So I think that's one step. The other step is making the process convenient, like I think we're seeing in California now. You get a ballot in the mail, you can vote it, send it back, you can vote it, take it back. You can show up in person and vote in an early voting period. You can show up on election day and vote. And then we also allow for ballots to be delivered if they're postmarked before the election, to allow for mail delays. So we have provisional voting. I mean, I think that just by allowing all these different processes, we just make the situation it all much more convenient and accessible. But we still need to make sure people get engaged and interested. And I think that's been the key part of the puzzle that's been missing until this election. Mm-hmm. And for various reasons, I think people are just engaged and motivated in this election. And we're going to have to figure out why and work to maintain that moving forward.
I think some of this question kind of fits into your polarization comments, but there's a serious lack of education around information literacy, evaluation, teaching people how to critically evaluate information they encounter. I mean, there's a whole Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, that talks about this too. And so how much do you think misinformation or lack of information or maybe too polarized of information played a part in this election?
Well, to be honest, mis and disinformation has been around ever since democracy was founded. Yep. And in fact, I wrote my dissertation. My dissertation is called Information in Elections. It was about not this exact topic, but about this topic. In politics, okay, political communications are often about mis and disinformation. Candidates have very strong incentives in many cases to be ambiguous, to be uncertain, and to say false and negative things about their opponents. I mean, it's an incredibly competitive business, and so there's really no way to effectively prevent that. And so, you know, I don't think that we can just say that, well, there's going to be some magic fix where we can suddenly make political candidates be more honest or provide better or clearer information. I think that part of that, you know, that burden falls upon us as citizens. You know, I think you're right. Civic education is something that's really important, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that, you know, K through 12 education is really focusing on providing, you know, students with the skills they need to become informed and to, you know, decide for themselves what's accurate and truthful and what's not. You know, and I think that we need to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to get higher education. Not everybody can go to Caltech, but, you know, we need to make, you know, higher education accessible and affordable. And again, to make sure that those curricula provide those same tools. And then, you know, for those of us who are no longer, you know, in college or in high school, you know, I think that, you know, we need to be very careful about ourselves, you know, policing what information we pay attention to. We have to be careful that, you know, our friends may not be, you know, the most accurate sources of information. News media organizations may be providing us with, you know, slightly biased information. I mean, they're in it to sell newspapers. We have to be careful of that. We have to be careful with what information we consume online, and to really try to use trusted sources. And so, you know, I think we have a lot of responsibility to be informed and to be well informed. And to be honest, I think many of us, you know, have really just abdicated on that responsibility, because it's really easy to go on Facebook and see what people are saying. It's not as easy to go on Facebook and to really try to understand the accuracy of what they're saying. And I think we need to be better consumers of information.
Kind of going back to your hypothesis that it possibly could go to the courts, how worried should we be given the current kind of breakdown of the Supreme Court as it relates to these kind of future cases of voter tampering or some voter count issues or anything that the Trump presidency has already threatened?
Well, you know, that's a concern. You know, you know, the Republicans rushed through to, you know, put a new justice on the court. And, you know, the president said that he did that because he wanted to make sure that he had a court that would be favorable for post-election contests for him. Right now, I'm not seeing anything that tends to indicate to me that there's a contest that would end up in the Supreme Court. Now, that I could be wrong about that. I am not a lawyer, okay, to be honest, but I'm not seeing anything yet that would lead to a contest that goes to the Supreme Court. I think what we're going to need to see is, you know, again, there's a process here. There will be recounts, and there will be re-examinations in states, and those contests are going to start, you know, usually in state courts or in lower courts. They could try to push them to the Supreme Court, but I'm just not seeing something that really rises to the level of a Supreme Court level case just yet. But again, I'm not a lawyer.
Yep. What do you think about the role of deep canvassing to help bridge divides in the electorate?
What does deep canvassing mean?
I don't know. Elise, are you on?
Yeah, it's basically just a way of getting out the vote where you're trying to have more in-depth conversations with people rather than just like asking what their vote is. It's supposed to be more effective, but I guess, yeah, so it seems like it would be a good thing to do.
No, yeah, it's just a question of terminology. Thanks for clarifying. So there's been some really important research that's been done on this approach, and you know, we've learned a lot about what it takes to get people excited and engaged. And you know, to be honest, it's not easy. You know, we know now that face-to-face persuasive communications are the most important tactic to get someone interested and engaged. And face-to-face persuasive conversation is expensive. It's hard to do. And in many ways in the pandemic, it's perhaps impossible. But I think that these kinds of techniques and the research that's gone on behind that kind of persuasion is really important. And I think you're absolutely right that those are the kinds of ways that we can engage people. We can get them talking about issues. We can make them better. We can get them better informed. But that's expensive and it's time consuming, and it's hard in a deeply divided country, right? To engage in that form of dialogue and that form of persuasion. But hopefully we'll see more of that. Moving forward. I think a lot's going to depend on what happens over the next couple of days, and kind of what the next who the next president is and what the next Congress looks like.
This question kind of aligns with something I was curious about too, but it looks like when you talk about polarization, the far right is really, we're talking about white men significantly. Why is that? Like, what's going on there?
Well, polarization is it's been around for a long time, and it comes and goes. We're in a particular period of partisan and ideological polarization. What's happening currently in American society that a lot of researchers have gotten concerned about is that partisan and ideological polarization is increasingly correlated with our demographics. It's increasingly correlated with education, where we live, color of our skin, economic issues or factors like income. Mm-hmm. And it's when all of these factors are highly correlated together, and it becomes very, very difficult, right, for us to deal with partisan conversations. And that I think is the big issue. And I got another stack of books down here below those. I've had a couple of reading courses with our PhD students with this literature. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you right now that there's no real conclusive answer as to why that's happened. It could be fueled by, various changes that have happened in society where we're kind of geographically sorting ourselves in ways we haven't before, where we're more likely to live in communities and neighborhoods that reflect our political and our social preferences. We're more likely online to be communicating with people who think and in many cases look like us. And there's lots of reinforcing kinds of factors in society that seem to be behind these trends. So there's not a conclusive like, well, here's what the solution needs to be. But I do think that, again, there's some pretty interesting research that's going on, and we're going to be looking at some of these same factors. And I wish I had a better answer for this question. But it's a clear problem, and it's clearly something that we need to start working to understand better, so we can start to work to bridge these political divides. We need to come together as a country. We're in the midst of this pandemic, and I hate to take this soapbox here, but to get out of this pandemic and to get back to a place where our economy and our society can function well, we have to overcome some of these divisions.
Mike, this is not a question. I'm not representing CCID or Caltech. This is my personal own question. I guess I was way too hopeful in thinking that it wouldn't be such a close race, right? And I, especially in light of the pandemic and what we've just experienced with the rise of Black Lives Matter and the protests that we've been experiencing, I don't know. I just am so shocked by by the red that covers my TV screen. And I'm just curious if there's any research, especially not just in other elections, but for Trump specifically, the Trump voter. It's like, what is going on there that there's so many of them? And is it really just a single issue thing? Is it really just the abortion issue? Is it really that they're sick of the pandemic and they love that Trump just is like, let's go back to living the way we've always lived? Or like, why am I seeing such a huge support of Trump when there is such a faction when it comes to the moral fabric of America and what I think would be the majority of our citizens to care about social justice issues. Like I'm just not understanding. It was just not what I expected to see. So
You're not the only one. I think that there were many people last night, who, when we started watching the election returns, really thought that the election yesterday would be a referendum on the president and on Trumpism, and that referendum would repudiate Trumpism and the president, and that just didn't happen. If you look at the map looks a lot like the map we saw in 2016. I mean, it's not changing that much. I mean, it may change enough that Biden may win, but it's not changed that much. And what that really indicates is that it's not the pandemic, okay? Because what fueled President Trump's victory in 2016 seems to also be occurring now in 2020. And so I think that the issues here I think are complicated, and I will tell you that I really don't think that political scientists or academic social scientists more generally have done a sufficient amount of work to really understand what's behind Trump and Trumpism, what's behind this phenomenon. And I'll speculate that, and that's because I think it's difficult. I think there's a lot of different reasons. Some of them are social issues, right? I think that many Trump and Trump supporters are very engaged by social issues and socially conservative issues. I think a lot of it is economic. And in economic and complicated ways that aren't easy for us as social scientists to understand. I think when you talk to people and when I talk to some of my friends who support Trump, it's about economic opportunity. It's about a sense of being kind of left behind. The world's changing dramatically, and people are scared of that, and they're fearful of that. And I think the president, in his campaign in 2016 and more also in 2020, he actually, builds off of that, and he successfully stokes those fears and anxieties a bit. And again, we don't have great tools to study that. I mean, we will typically study, why do people vote for a president with a big survey sample, right? And we don't have great questions that ask, about fear and anxiety and get into these really deeply nuanced, kind of understandings for why people may vote for President Trump or not. We need to do a better job as social scientists, and maybe combine qualitative and quantitative work in ways that we just haven't done before. Or figure out better ways, like Dean Mobbs. I don't know if Dean's on this call. Dean has pioneered how to study fear and anxiety experimentally. And maybe, those are approaches that we need to work on to try to better understand some of this. Clearly, we don't know the answer. And I wish I could answer that question, because, I think that understanding what's behind, Trump and Trumpism is a factor that will help us better understand what's fueling the polarization that we're seeing in the country, and perhaps allow us to more effectively deal with it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the most polarized because of this current president. Maria, did you have a question you want to ask in person?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. This is been so much greater information in what you were saying, that you need to kind of educate the public, and then I'm getting educated by you, and then I like all that information. But I have a question, because I'm a Latina, and I have a lot of even relatives that they go to the other side, and I explain it to them why, and they still don't get it. But one of the fears me is that no matter which way we go, if we go one way, that people still not gonna, and they're not gonna think different. And then if we stay the way we are, people's just gonna get more ammunition to keep going. I have never in my life seen somebody that we supposed to look after and protect us equally to be so against a nation and to do the ridiculous things that he does. It's just like, I'm feeling like this is for real. Like, where we going? How we supposed to cater, and how we supposed to keep, going forward instead of backwards, and then also try to survive as a Latina, because I get, a lot of people goes after me because I look the way I look. It's just gonna be more. It's not gonna stop. But how we educate our younger kids to survive this situation that we're going through.
Sorry for the big sigh there. I understand, and I agree. And this is really where I think we need to start to better understand what's fueling, right, the fear and resentment and anxieties that I think the president has successfully used as tactics in both of his campaigns and as president. I think we need to understand why those tactics work, and what's behind, again, that the fear and anxiety that's leading, people to target immigrants, to target people of color. We just need to understand that, and I honestly don't have the answer to that, but we need to understand it. And you're absolutely right. We need to deal with this because it's just not good for our society to be so divided and so divisive with each other, especially when we're dealing with the pandemic like we're dealing with. And again, I wish I had a simple solution. I don't, but I just think we're going to have to really try to work to figure this out. And I hope that whoever is next president, really steps up as a leader, because we desperately need leadership at this point to navigate us through this pandemic. And in particular, the thing I worry the most about is what kind of economy and what kind of society are we leaving to our children and the next generation? And we need some serious leadership to provide, the right kind of economy and a sustainable climate and a good, bright future for the next generation, for the generation of Caltech students who we're training and teaching right now. I have no idea what kind of economy they're going to face when they go on the job market over the next couple of years. And so, our next president has got the work cut out for them.
So Mike, I want to be thoughtful of your time because I know you're great in demand here. So it's 1:11. How much more time do you have or can give us, or maybe one or two more questions? What do you think?
Yeah, a couple more questions. I can easily go for another 5 minutes.
Okay, you got it. So there's a question about, do you think that more states will try to adopt congressional district methods in the distribution of their electoral college votes, like Maine and Nebraska after this election? What are the political legal pathways for that? That's a little 101 on what this question even means about congressional district methods.
All right, so there states, the Constitution has the electoral college, and states are delegated significant authority over how they run elections and how they delegate their electoral college votes. Some states are winner take all, some states are more proportional. And this question is really asking, well, what's it going to take to get more states to move to some sort of more proportional allocation of their electoral college votes so that the electoral college, becomes more representative. I think that's a state by state issue. And again, I don't, we tend to see these kind of reforms happen when one side loses and they have the ability to make changes. I think we'll see more. We'll know more, depending upon the outcome of this election and whether or not there seems to be another significant kind of electoral college bias in the outcome. It's hard for me to have a crystal ball on this one because again, it's going to depend upon, the outcome of the election. I do think that what we will see is we're probably going to see, some, especially, again, depending upon who's president, how this will shake out. There's probably going to be some serious discussion about various types of electoral reform. Whether that's electoral college, I don't know. Whether that's more voting by mail, I don't know.
Okay, and let's do one more question here, more of a practical one. Do you have any advice for us as we are addressing lab colleagues' concerns about election results, or even discussing these conversations with folks who might disagree? Are there some good methods or resources that you kind of employ as you're talking about these kinds of very divisive issues?
Well, that's a hard one, because again, as we know, seriously, because we're so divided now, and I'll just have to confess that I find it personally very difficult right now to talk to some of my friends, because we are at just extreme ends of these conversations at this point. But I think as we move forward, we've got holiday seasons coming up. I mean, I think we're going to have hopefully we'll know the resolution of the presidential race pretty quickly. I think we do need to start to get to a place where we try, and I'm going to have to do this myself, to be more civil in our conversations with each other about these divisive topics. Try harder to engage, and try to be a bit more understanding. The pandemic has not helped with that. I will just confess that I know the pandemic has been hard on all of us. It's difficult because you can't deal with your friends and your family who may disagree with you necessarily face to face. Zoom and Google Meet and all these formats are just not conducive, right, for having these kinds of conversations that ordinarily we would do face to face, where we can try to better understand where people are coming from and their opinions, because we can see their body language and we can interact a little more closely personally. So again, my goal this fall and moving into the winter is to try to be a bit more understanding with some of my friends who I'm not currently agreeing with. That's a personal goal of mine, because I have to confess I've not done a great job of that myself.
Yeah, you and me both. So with that, thank you so much, Mike, for coming, and I so appreciate your time. Do you want to project a win?
Nope. I did that in 2016, and I've regretted it ever since. I just think we need to let the election officials do their work and trust the process. And you know what? It's going to take a few days. And I think there are going to be a number of bumps in the road. But again, just trust the process, be patient. And, again, thank you everybody for participating. And if you have any other questions, reach out, email rma@caltech.edu. I'm easy to find. And, we will get through this election.
All right.
Thanks, Anna, for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much. So,